Last time we spoke, the heavenly kingdom of great peace, Tianjin, had finally fallen to the forces of Zheng Guofan and the Xiang army. Hong Xiuquan, the self-proclaimed brother of Jesus Christ, was dead. All the remaining Taiping kings and Hong's son were hunted down and executed. History's bloodiest civil war was over, claiming the lives of 20 to 30 million people. Yet this civil war was just one event amongst many simultaneously occurring in the Qing dynasty. Foreign encroachment and internal strife were breaking down the dynasty brick by brick. China was facing an uncomfortable situation. She had to modernize to survive against threats abroad and within. Another nation, just across the sea, faced the same kind of cataclysm, but would undergo a vastly different approach. Henceforth, the two nations, China, Big Brother, and Japan, Little Brother, would never be the same again. This episode is China and Japan, Big Brother and Little Brother. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment on episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I'm just finishing up a multi-part series on China's warlord era. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there you find early access to all of my content, voting rights for subjects I'm going to tackle next, Discord rights to the Pacific War Discord channel, which I hope you do check out because it's a good place to tell me what you like about this series, live hangouts and some gaming sessions, and of course exclusive content, especially podcasts. So if there's something you want to hear more about, just check out my Patreon and let me know, and I'll make a podcast directed towards it. Please check it out, it'll mean a lot to me. Now, I want to say this just right off the bat. For those of you who are fans of my YouTube channel and have seen, some of my content, you already know my background from the very beginning was the history of Japan. It was, in fact, my love of Japanese history that led me to the history of China, and I think that says a lot about these two nations. You simply cannot speak about one's history without speaking about the other's. I could delve quite deeply into the opening up of Japan, its turbulent Bakumatsu period, which is my personal favorite, the Boshin War, the Meiji Restoration, the Satsuma Rebellion, etc., etc. But this podcast is about the fall and rise of China. While my personal channel deals with both nations, trying to give an equal amount of narrative to explain both their developments, I want to try my very best to keep it closer to the hip, as they say. If you want more details about the historic events of Japan from the 1600s all the way up to 1890 or so, well, you can go check out my personal channel. Or hell, perhaps you can just become a patron over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel and scream at me to do some very specific podcasts to go more in depth on certain subjects you want to hear more about. I certainly would love to dabble more into it. Like, let's take an example here. When I was doing my episode on the Boshin War, I learned a lot about the Shinsengumi, who were, to summarize brutally, they're like a samurai police force who fought to the bitter end for the Tokugawa shogunate. And I could see myself doing a exclusive Patreon episode on just them. They're an awesome group. And there's a lot of movies made about them that are quite cool from Japan. But anyways, needless to say, I'm going to try my very best to direct this more so at China. Now, the last time we spoke, I went over the end of the Taiping Rebellion, a momentous part of the history of modern China. I literally sighed with relief upon completing that large series. Then I stared at a blank page. Where do I even begin now? The first thing that came to mind is how to explain what occurred to both China and Japan in the mid-19th century. Both nations were forced to modernize lest they become colonized by foreign powers. For China, this was brutal. She was quite literally being carved up. But for Japan, who had spent 265 years almost completely isolated under her Sakoku policy, she was opened up. She went through hyper-modernization and thwarted colonization as a result. Japan's story is quite different for numerous reasons, major ones being that she got the enormous benefit of seeing what was happening to China and learning directly from China's predicament. After the West defeated China during the Opium Wars and Commodore Perry opened up Japan in 1853, Asia could no longer maintain a separate existence. Both nations were forced to begin the process of becoming part of the world. Japan had many natural advantages over China. She was made up of 4 islands, very compact. She had sea transportation, which was widely available to her. Her communications did not have to link very far. China would only get its first telegraph in the 1880s, and it took their government communications nearly a month to travel from one end of the country to the other. Japan, being an island, had always felt vulnerable to dangers from the sea. This sense of danger prompted Japan to seek knowledge of the outside world to protect herself. Chinese leaders had to worry about enemies coming over land from multiple directions. Thus, they were less concerned about the seas. Japan had isolated herself for 265 years, while China had become the literal pinnacle of civilization, hoarding the world's silver supply. Thus, as you can imagine, Japanese leadership were not as confident as the Chinese, who saw themselves as, well, on top of the world. And you know that saying, or the game, goes, King of the Mountain, anybody? Well, it's hard to sometimes see people coming after you when you are on top. Japan was also more homogeneous, whereas China had hundreds of differing people. Han, Manchus, Mongols, Uyghurs, Tibetans, etc., etc. Unifying such people and maintaining domestic harmony was pretty much impossible. China was also undergoing a population boom in the 19th century, alongside massive food shortages. This led to the terrible rebellions such as the Taiping Rebellion, and I think we covered that one pretty well. There was also the Nian Rebellion, which we talked about a little bit, but of course there were plenty others. So I think we all know by now the Taiping Rebellion encompassed many issues ongoing in China. For the Nian Rebellion, it occurred mostly in the north and was basically peasants banding together to survive. Natural disasters had taken a toll, food was scarce, and when the bad times come, especially in China, bandits begin to roam. To fight off the bandits, the Nian formed militias, but as you can imagine, the Qing saw this and, well, they freaked out. The main purpose of the Nian Rebellion was to survive, and to resist taxation, something I personally can subscribe to. Inevitably, the Nian looted and raided as a means to keep their group going on, clashing with other bandits, the Qing, and other rebel groups, even like the Taiping. Much like the Taiping, the Nian failed to topple the Qing dynasty, and they were quelled gradually through the Qing's ruthless campaigns that used scorched earth tactics against them. The Nian also were in the north, and thus they faced the forces of Mongol general Prince Song. Prince Sung defeated the Nian and killed their greatest leader, Jiang Luxing, in 1863, from which they never recovered. After the Second Opium War was done, the Qing simply were more able to deal with the internal rebellions, and the Nian unfortunately were very close to Beijing, and not as formidable as the Taiping. Now, while all of this was going on, multiple Muslim rebellions occurred. There was a Hui Muslim-backed Panthay Rebellion in southwestern China, found mostly in Yunnan province. Panthay is the Burmese word used by Burmese for Chinese Muslims who arrived from Burma to Yunnan province. They were fighting discrimination, and like many other rebellions during the time, they saw the Manchu were weakened as a result of the Opium Wars, and they decided, well, there was an opportunity to become independent. By the way, while I am referring to this as a quote Muslim rebellion, it was not at all exclusively Muslim. Many non-Muslims joined them, such as the Shan and Kachin people of Burma. Once the Qing had finally dealt with the Taiping menace, and they had a stronger hand to go south, well, they gradually quelled the rebellion down south by 1868. Now there is another rebellion going on in China's northwest territories, and it is associated with the Pantai Rebellion, and sometimes the Pantai Rebellion is actually attached to this one. It is known as the Dungan Revolt, or Dungan Revolts, because it's actually multiple events, not just one. It was led mostly by Hui Muslim Chinese in Jiangxi, Gansu, Xinjiang, and Ningxia provinces. These revolts raged from 1862 to 1877, and they began from conflicts between Hui and Han Chinese, amongst many other groups. It's actually a very confusing event to talk about. It was simply a terrible time leading to massacres, famines, massive migrations of people, plagues, awful stuff. In northwest China, it's estimated something like 21 million people died. Zhou Zongtang, a subordinate of Zhang Guofan, rose to prominence and created his own army based on the Xiang model called the Chu Army. He largely was responsible for quelling the Dungan revolts in the end. And I'm just going to say it right now, I am quite a few podcasts ahead writing-wise when it comes to these scripts, and I am currently writing a script specifically on the Dungan revolts. I caved in, I simply cannot not talk about this one. It'll be kind of a side episode. Hopefully I'll be able to put it up on this podcast. If not, it might become, let's say, exclusive content on my Patreon for a little bit before it goes up here. Because it doesn't necessarily fit the next few podcasts that are coming up. Anyways, China was dealing with a lot. The 1860s in general were quite the turning point for China and Japan. Both nations gained new governing structures and resumed official contact with another for the first time in over 2 centuries. For Japan, the 1860s were part of what is called the Bakumatsu period. It's this very messy point in their history where the leadership of Japan was frantically trying to figure out how to save themselves from colonization. Over in China, the 1860s leads us to a period known as the Tangji Restoration, named after the new emperor. The Taiping by the early 1860s were on a steady decline, and this gave the Qing leadership finally a moment to try and rebuild national strength. For Japan, this period saw the shogun being overthrown in 1868, and this led to a bitter war called the Boshin War of 1868 to 1869. One of my personal favorite wars, by the way. I have an episode over my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, if you want a full rundown and you want to see a ton of clips from Chimbata films, which I personally feel gave the episode a lot of flavor. But to brutally summarize, there was a call to end the Tokugawa shogunate. They even gave the Tokugawa family a great severance package, but the shogun did not want to go down without a fight. Loyal Hans and the Shinsengumi fought to retain the shogunate, while the Hans of Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa rose up and defeated them. After the shogunate was dissolved, Japan went into the Great Meiji Restoration, which I also have a full episode on, and I'm sorry for these shameless plugins, over at my personal channel, the Pacific War channel. I perhaps will get into it a bit later, but to just kind of brutally summarize, the Meiji Restoration is the greatest feat of modernization, I would say, in human history. It's a hyper-modernization process where Japan took the very best aspects of the outside world while trying to retain important parts of their own culture to mold Japan into a modern state. They were extremely successful, and as a result achieved the #1 goal of the Meiji Restoration, thwarting colonization from the West. Thus, the Japanese had resolutely responded to the challenges from the West. As for China, with the death of Empress Yanfeng in 1861 came the enthronement of Emperor Tongji at the age of 5. The Qing leadership were eager to restore the social order that had been severely damaged by the Taiping Rebellion, the Second Opium War, and countless other rebellions. Empress Yanfeng, who died at the age of 30, was considered a failed emperor. And I mean, I would have to strongly agree. The guy spent all of his time getting high, messing with his harem, and then he fled the capital, never returning to it. China had been left in a disastrous state, but with the defeat of the Taiping came new leadership. That leadership was not Emperor Cixi, but rather a mix of Prince Gong and Empress Dowager Cixi. Empress Dowager Cixi proved to be very skilled in managing court politics and quickly became the dominant power during the Tongzhi period. And that power would last basically until her death in 1908. Yes, for those of you who don't know about her, she is arguably one of the most powerful women in human history. And she is quite an infamous figure for modern Chinese history. There are legends and myths about her that go on and on. I mean, my God, the biography on this woman is fascinating. Now, Prince Gong and the other officials realized that to cope with the foreigners, new skills and new technology, especially that of shipping and weaponry, would be required. But many Qing officials remained focused on cultivating the moral qualities that they considered essential for national vitality. Empress Dowager Cixi and many Qing officials believed that the essence of China's problems stemmed from the loss of true Confucian spirit. To address this problem, they sought to restore the importance of the imperial examination system and to eliminate the major corrupt issue that had emerged, that of buying and selling offices. As I had pointed out during the Opium Wars series, while in the past the integrity of the Qing dynasty and the other dynasties before it lay in the officials being appointed by their merits after taking the imperial examination, starting around the 19th century, this all kind of fell apart. Officials were gradually purchasing their appointments, and other high-ranking officials began selling appointments, such as the situation with the Kohong merchants, who basically inherited an incredible debt upon taking their role, and they were expected to extort funds to pay back their backers. The Qing dynasty was extremely corrupt, and would just keep getting worse and worse. Cixi valued the importance of symbolism and undertook the building of the new summer palace after it was burnt down during the Second Opium War. Her name would infamously be attached to the building of the summer palace, which was unbelievably expensive. Countless accusations and myths, for that matter, would involve Cixi utilizing funds for the necessities of the empire instead for the summer palace. Some of these accusations are quite true, and some are just myths that have evolved into monstrosities. Now, in 1861, China launched a self-strengthening movement. This focused upon training troops, building their ships, and producing their own weaponry. Self-strengthening movements were not new to China. They had been seen countless times, such as when the Ming dynasty began seeking foreign aid to fend off against the Qing invasion, all the way back in the 16th century. Now, as we saw during the end half of the Taiping Rebellion series, Zheng Guofan tackled self-strengthening head-on. One of Zheng Guofan's scholar colleagues was a man named Feng Guifin, who had sent him a series of essays in 1861 highlighting the issue of self-strengthening. Feng spent considerable time focusing and studying warfare against the Taiping, specifically in the east around Shanghai. He was very impressed by Western military technology present there and would often write to Zheng Guofan about it. Likewise, Zheng Guofan wrote in his diaries about self-strengthening and how Western technology could be used to defend China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Zheng Guofan's second-hand man, Li Hongzhang, likewise wrote of self-strengthening during this time period and identified how Western power relied upon their technology and that China must learn to construct the same machines that they had. He advocated first to apply this to the military, but gradually it must also apply to industry at large. As we saw during the Taiping Rebellion, there was a large struggle by both the Qing and Taiping to get their hands on Western arms. Zheng Guofan purchased many Western arms for his Xiang army, and the Qing famously employed the Ava forces. By 1860, the majority of the Qing leadership types, including the scholar class, were very aware they had to move with the times and to study Western technology. By 1861, this pushed China to officially begin a self-strengthening movement. which can be seen to have three phases. The first one goes from around 1861 to 1872, the second from 1872 to 1885, and the third from 1885 to 1895. The first phase focused on the training of troops, building ships, and the production of arms. With support from Prince Gang, Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and Zhou Zongtang, and other officials began major projects. Zheng Guofan established an arsenal in Shanghai, Li Hongzhang built one in Nanjing and Tianjin, and Zhou Zongtang built a dockyard at Fuzhou, amongst many other projects, but these were the biggest. The arsenals were created with the help of foreign advisors and administrators who set up schools for the study of specific sciences like mechanics. The Qing government likewise created the Tongwenguan, School of Combined Learning in Beijing. The purpose of the school was initially to teach foreign languages, but it would gradually expand course curriculum towards astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, medicine, and so on. The school would begin a transformative process and lead to the construction of similar schools. Li Hongzhang, for example, would go on to create language schools in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Fuzhou, pioneering Western studies. Zheng Guofan, Li Hongzhang, and Zhou Zongtang initially used foreign workers to build up their factories and arms, until their own native Chinese could learn the skills necessary to replicate the processes. At Li Hongzhang's Jiangnan arsenal, they began producing Remington breech loading rifles. They began production in 1871, and by 1873 they produced 4,200 rifles. The rifles were expensive to make and inferior to actual Remington rifles, but it was a start. The naval dockyards at Fuzhou, amongst others, had a much more difficult job ahead of them. By the time they began producing ships, they turned out to be twice as expensive as that of simply purchasing ships from places like Britain. This led China to purchase more and more ships to meet the demand, and by the 1880s, China would be purchasing and creating more ships than even Japan. Also in the 1880s, Li Hongzhang established the China Merchants Steam Navigation Company to help China create its own commercial shipping, something necessary for modern trade. Another big process of modernization in the 19th century was, of course, trains. Chinese laborers famously traveled to North America to help build the great railroad systems in both the United States and Canada. And I can tell you right now, I had to write a lot of essays during my undergrad about the experience of Chinese laborers building some of those railways in western parts of Canada. Horrifying stories. Horrifying. Anyways, this prompted Qing officials to advocate for the same thing in China. Famous figures like Lin Zexu and Hong Rengan called for this early on. However, the hardline conservative types, most notably Empress Dowager Cixi, were very reluctant about steam engine technology, and specifically that of trains. There were various reasons they were wary over railroad development. In 1865, a British merchant built a 600-meter-long railroad outside the Shenwu Gate in Beijing to demonstrate the technology to the Qing imperial court. The court's reactions were mixed. They were certainly impressed by its functionality, but also found it very noisy and very strange, so they had it quickly dismantled. It would not be until 1876 when the first railroad was established, known as the Wusang Road. It went from the American concession in Shanghai to Wusang, present-day Jiabei district. It was built by Jardé and Matheson and Company, the nefarious company that sunk its teeth into China since the first days of the opium smuggling. The construction of the railroad was done without approval from the Qing government, and this would get dismantled the next year. Then in 1881, another railroad was created, the Taiping Tramway, and the Imperial Railways of Northern China. British engineer Claude William Kinder spearheaded the project with the support of Li Hongzhang, creating the line from Tangshan to Xuguizhuang. It would expand eventually to Tianjin in 1888 and Shanhaiguan by 1894. It got the name Guannewei Railway and was met with multiple attempts by conservative Qing officials to be dismantled. Famously, Empress Dowager Cixi fought against Li Hongzhang, who persisted to tell her railways were necessary to advance China. She was against their construction because she believed their noise would disturb the emperor's tombs. Li Hongzhang tried everything he could to get her on board, and at one point she tried to compromise by asking him if the train carts could be simply horse-drawn instead. That is a real story. Yet despite her rather hilarious attempts to thwart railway construction, by the 1890s great railways were created to link up eastern and central China. Now over in Japan, after the Boshin War was over, Japan famously sent a mission out to the west known as the Urur Mission of 1871 to 1873. The purpose of the mission was to study the most important aspects of the West from the most powerful nations. The diplomats and students that were sent on the mission would become key leaders in the new Meiji government of Japan, driving the restoration. China was also performing its own kind of Urur mission, but this was not as large in scale, and those who were sent did not exactly end up becoming the great drivers of modernization like their Japanese counterparts were. 3 years before the Urur mission, a Chinese delegation known as the Burlingame Mission arrived to the United States. The delegation extended its journey to Britain, France, Prussia, Russia, and visited smaller nations briefly before returning back to China in 1870. The purpose of the delegation was to investigate how Westerners conducted diplomacy so that the Qing could figure out a means to get rid of the unequal treaties. It was the very same reason the Japanese sent their Urur mission. Anson Burlingame, a U.S. minister and envoy to Beijing, was appointed by the Qing to lead the delegation. Around 30 members attended the mission, and in 1870, Burlingame died of pneumonia, forcing 2 of the Chinese delegates, Zhigang and Sun Jiagu, to take the reins of it. They met with heads of state, visited factories, shipyards, mines, all things big industry. They got to see electricity, numerous machines, many scientific wonders, but also the plight of their own people. Yes, they got to witness the conditions of the Chinese workers along the railways in places like California. They got to see firsthand Chinese taking sticks of dynamite, going into some mines, and never returning. This prompted some delegates to ask the question, why do Christian missionaries who do such good work in China bully Chinese workers in California? The delegate Shigang would publish some of these observations in a book giving very harrowing accounts. Another delegate, Zhang Jize, the eldest son of Zhang Guofan, came back with extremely positive opinions of everything he saw in the West, and he was met with harsh criticism from conservative officials who thought he was being far too sympathetic towards foreign customs. Li Hongzhang and other officials, however, grabbed the delegates when they got back to China, extremely eager to hear all about what they had seen. Li Hongzhang was particularly interested in the political and economic aspects of the West. Likewise, Empress Dowager Cixi personally met with some of the delegates when they got back, asking questions about things that happened abroad. Even the conservative types were gravely concerned with how things were moving along in the West. But the end result did not lead to a Meiji restoration. While Japanese leaders were investing into industry and infrastructure, Chinese leaders were looking to restore their national spirit instead. It's hard to blame the Qing leaders, unlike Japan, who largely avoided conflict with the West, though there were a few fights in Satsuma domain against the British, for example. Well, the Qing were like an old boxer who had just got KO'd a few too many times. The Opium Wars and internal rebellions had destroyed the Chinese public's faith in their own government. The fabric of the mandate of heaven was unraveling. So instead of putting all the money into industry, many projects were enacted to reinvigorate the grandeur of the Qing. As I had said, Empress Dowager Cixi famously invested incredible sums of money to renovate the Summer Palace in Beijing. Infamously, she took funds intended for modernizing the Navy and used them to build a marble boat pavilion at the Summer Palace. That specific story lives in infamy to this day. And it is not just a story, there are myths and legends associated with it that have an everlasting effect on how how the Qing dynasty is seen, actually. Li Hongzhang believed, in addition to the factories, arsenals, and shipyards, China needed to update its school system and wanted to send students abroad, just like Japan was doing. He also advocated that the civil service exams should offer technical knowledge alongside the cultural knowledge, and he was met with large-scale protest. By 1885, conservatives in Beijing began cracking down on the modernization process. So while Chinese students stayed for the most part in China, Japan was sending countless abroad to learn everything they could from the West. Now, the Urur mission that was sent to the West also came to China on its way back. After witnessing 15 nations and all of their wonders, they came over to Shanghai, where they spent 3 days. They were hosted by the Shanghai official, Chen Fuxun, and they were shocked by what they saw in the city. That shock was a lack of change. The travelers who had grown up in a world where China was Big Brother were shocked that Big Brother seemed to have fallen behind. Kume Kunitake, the chief chronicler of the voyage, said this of his first impressions of Shanghai. "There are no sewers, and the urine flows along the streets. Amid all this, the inhabitants seem quite unconcerned." Believing that the Japanese were harboring illusions about Chinese sophistication based on the past, he tried to correct the view of his countrymen who, quote, "regarded every Chinese to be a refined gentleman, well versed in literature and the arts. Thus, in Japan, the custom still persists of holding any curios, calligraphy, paintings, poetry, or literature from China in high esteem. Under the Qing dynasty, learning has been stagnant in China." The members of the Urur mission had all studied history, and they knew of the great Tang dynasty and the greatest of China. But now in 1873, they thought there was very little to learn from her anymore. They shared a kinship with China, wished to see that she could resist the Western encroachments and remain a great civilization. But it looked to them that China had no great leadership. China, Japan, and even Korea had young emperors, but only Emperor Meiji would acquire real authority. In China, Emperor Tongzhi took the throne at 5, but in reality it was Empress Dowager Cixi who was really running the show. In Korea, Emperor Hongzhang took the throne at the age of 12 in 1864, but his father, Dowager, really held the power. Both King Hongzhang and Emperor Tongzhi would be hampered by their relatives and isolated from advisors who might educate them on Western advances. Emperor Meiji, meanwhile, was tutored by senior advisors starting in 1868, preparing him for the role of leadership. Lack of leadership led to a lack of ability to reign in certain aspects of modernization necessary for progress. In Japan, key individuals working with Emperor Meiji grabbed the reins of foreign affairs, gradually dismantling the unequal treaties that the West had forced upon Japan. The key individual in China who would undertake foreign affairs was Li Hongzhang, who was for the most part doing everything on his own initiative, and he had to constantly fight off the conservatives. In Japan, foreign affairs specialists emerged, but this was not the case in China. Even Emperor Meiji himself took an interest in learning about foreign affairs. Japan hired many Western specialists in all aspects of governmental bureaucracy to help train the Japanese. When Chinese officials were sent to Japan in 1877 to set up a legation, they were astonished to find the Japanese bureaucracy for foreign affairs, unlike that in China, had completely adopted European procedures and protocols. One of the Urur mission delegates was a man named Ito Hirobumi, who would serve in the Foreign Office, becoming the very first Prime Minister of Japan in 1885. He studied in England, learning quickly that Japan was weaker than her, and that Japan needed to learn from her to become strong. With his ability to speak English, Ito Hirobumi became the key man responsible for negotiations with other nations. He was to be Li Hongzhang's Japanese counterpart, and he helped negotiate the Treaty of Tianjin in 1858 with Li Hongzhang himself. Both men would have a special relationship that was long-lasting and quite tragic. The first time Chinese and Japanese officials would meet after 2 centuries of having non-contact was when the Sensei Maru arrived in Shanghai in 1862. The officials were strangers without precedence. They had no idea how to move forward. The Japanese members of the first Senzimaru trip were carefully selected for their ability not only to learn about potential markets for Japanese goods, but also to investigate the political situation so that Japan could open formal relations with China. 51 Japanese took part on the mission, which lasted over 2 months. The highest-ranking Chinese official in Shanghai was our old friend, Wu Xu. Since no Chinese were in Japan prior to notify them about the mission, they literally just showed up to Shanghai, and this certainly perplexed Wu Xu as to what he should do. Wu Xu reported the delegation's arrival to Beijing, but he received a reply with no clear directions, and thus he acted with caution. The Dutch helped the two sides speak and assured Wu Xu that the Japanese were reliable traders, and this prompted Wu Xu to accept selling their goods. The Japanese brought things they already knew the Chinese market most likely desired. Sea products, lacquerware, paper fans, nothing too fancy. Trade was quite slow. No treaties or relations were established, but the Japanese gathered great intelligence on the status of the Qing dynasty. They had not yet recovered from the Taiping Rebellion, and to the Japanese, China looked like it was in pure chaos. They were shocked by the poverty, the filth, the lack of hygiene. They were very disappointed to find out their ancestors, whom they considered the greatest civilization, seemed to be in rubbles. They were outraged to find how mistreated the Chinese were at the hands of Westerners. They thought the Westerners were extremely arrogant, mistreating Chinese like slaves in their own country. It was very shameful. They greatly worried what the British and French had done to the Chinese during the Opium Wars might come to Japan. And indeed, the British made a minor attack in Satsuma Domain in 1863 and Choshu Domain in 1864, raising those concerns. And so, Little Brother was learning from Big Brother's plight. But Little Brother would not remain little for very long. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where at this point I am releasing my final episode in my China's Warlord Era series. Also, just a friendly reminder and a thank you to all of those that have joined my Patreon account, found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Really means a lot to me that some of you are joining me over there, and the more that join, the better the chances I'm going to create more and more exclusive podcasts just for you on subjects you want to hear more about that maybe I can't cover here or in other projects I'm associated with. So if you haven't already, please go check it out, and please join my Discord server, the Pacific War Channel Discord, just to, hang out with me, talk to me, let me know how much I mispronounce things, because I know I do. China and Japan went through their own processes of modernization, which were dramatically different to say the least. Li Hongzhang was emerging at the forefront, and he desperately was trying to help China modernize, but he was just one man amongst many.